Hi there everybody, welcome to Organisational Behaviour Buzzy 1029. In this video we're going to talk about development. The objectives for this class are that you should, by the end of it, be able to define organisational development, think about enablers and barriers to what we're going to call organisational innovation, which is a modern way of talking about development, and consider some of the downsides of development. So the key readings for this week is actually there is no real key reading for this week or this class to support this class. The core reading in the 6th edition of the textbook is actually specific to development, which is chapter 17. However, by the 9th edition of Huczynski and Buchanan, they've actually taken this chapter out and they've folded it into the chapter on organisational change. We're going to keep this as a separate session though, because I want to emphasise to you that you have development or innovation as a managed process which the organisation tries to control, whereas change is a way of describing alterations and transformations that happen in organisations for a variety of reasons, often not planned changes on the part of leaders of organisations. So we're going to continue thinking about development and innovation as separate issues. So let's get started thinking about development. So classically, organisational development was seen as a systematic process whereby an organisation tried to improve its performance and its effectiveness. And it would involve diagnosing particular problems or inefficiencies, or what, if you wanted to use more sophisticated language, we would call dysfunctions. Diagnose particular problems, issues, or dysfunctions that were occurring in an organisation and impeding its effectiveness. So these might be at the level of the organisation itself. They might be between groups in the organisation, within a group or a team or a department, or even on the part of an individual. So once an organisational development programme had diagnosed these issues, identified what they were, the organisation would then try to develop some kind of intervention strategy in an attempt to improve effectiveness. So if this was an individual, perhaps there was an individual who was unable to perform their job role because they lacked the necessary skills. Well, an intervention strategy then would be to provide some training and support for them, and subsequently then to evaluate the success of those strategies. This is now often folded into what we would call human resource management or training and development. But that typically is about individuals. Organisational development is a broader process which might look not only at individuals, but like I say, also at departments and teams, or even between relationships between teams, or at the organisation itself, perhaps looking at the organisation's culture or the organisation's structure. So there are various different ways of enacting development plans or development interventions in organisations. We'll just pick out a couple here. You can have action research, which involves going in and studying the organisation, trying to find out where are those problems, where are those issues. In participatory action research, you actually bring in participants from the organisation to try to find those problems themselves. This has been developed into a topic you'll probably cover elsewhere on your degree as you move forward. It's called lean management or business process re-engineering. You have what's called force field analysis, and the idea of force field analysis is to identify where there are resistances and constraints to change. What are the things that are resisting change? And then trying to analyse, well, what are the things that are pushing for change? And how are those two forces interacting within the organisation to identify pinch points, resistances, and then develop interventions to overcome them. So there's a whole host of different intervention strategies. Again, we won't go through them all in this video. You can look into them as you wish. But the key point is to understand organisational development is this systematic process of diagnosing a problem in an organisation, developing some kind of intervention, and then evaluating the success of that intervention. And as I say, the key point is this is a managed process. Often, in recent times, many organisational development interventions have been focused on what's known as bureaucratic diseases. So there's a suspicion that bureaucracies are too divided, they have too strict and rigid boundaries, they have too fixed hierarchies, they have one-way communication, so information flows down from the top to those at the bottom, but not up from the bottom, and that there are routine jobs and tight controls which are very boring for people. And this has led to some quite sort of standard organisational development cures. So if we think about the routinization and the formalization of work, the tight levels of control in many bureaucracies, well, one response to this has been to improve jobs, to create some of those hygiene and motivating factors that we talked about in our class on motivation. This might be job rotation, allowing people to do different jobs. It might be job enrichment, trying to give people more autonomy, give people more responsibility. It might be about career progression, allowing people to take on supervisory training to become managers and move up through the hierarchy. These are all cures or interventions which have been found to work in organisational development. Because it turns out that lots of organisations, because they have very similar structures and often quite similar cultures, as we've seen in previous video recordings, they have similar problems no matter what the organisation's actually doing, whether it's a public administration, a public utility, a big corporation. Bureaucratic diseases dog many organisations, so developing intervention strategies that work in one setting often translate into intervention strategies that work across many different settings. So that's development. In more recent times, we've seen issues around development also expand into what we would call new product development or entrepreneurship, where it's no longer simply about improving the effectiveness of the organisation in terms of the way the organisation relates to itself, but also about improving the effectiveness of the organisation and improving the offerings or the services of the organisation. So it's no longer just about doing the same things better, but also about identifying whether the organisation is doing the right things and then doing those right things better. And this is what the concept of innovation refers to. So innovation is not simply about reacting to a problem in an organisation. It's also a more positive attempt to try to find solutions to problems that the organisation didn't know existed. So innovation can be defined as a multi-stage process where an organisation tries to transform ideas, products, services and processes. And we could add to that things like structures and cultures, in order to advance, compete or differentiate themselves from competition. So we can think of development as identifying problems and responding to them, and we can think of innovation as a sort of improvement to organisations. So if you will, organisational development is like when you feel ill and you go to the doctor and get some medicine to cure you. Innovation is like self-improvement, going to the gym to make yourself look and feel even better. Okay, so we've talked about organisational development, and in fact, actually, let's put and also define innovation, because I think that's kind of what we're doing, right? But now let's talk a little bit more about innovation. Organisational development is relatively easy to study because it's what we would call, you can do intervention studies. So you look to see how something was before, how was a team or an individual performing. Then you can look to see how they were performing afterwards and see if they have improved. And throughout organisation studies, and I'm sure you've covered them on your course already, organisational researchers have identified easy ways of improving effectiveness or developing organisations. If you just think back to the classic Hawthorne studies where they changed the lighting in rooms and found this increased output. Measuring interventions is relatively easy, but
innovation is a little bit more tricky because often you don't know what the problem is. So let's talk a little bit more about innovation. Christensen, Bohmer and Kenagy talk about different types of innovation. So they differentiate sustaining innovations, which is what you might call doing the same thing better, from disruptive innovations. So sustaining innovations in consumer terms would take, an existing process, a service or product and just make it better. They'd make a faster mobile phone or a more efficient car. Disruptive innovations, however, create wholly new ways of doing things, completely change how an organisation works or what consumers want to consume. And disruptive innovations are really difficult to manage, they're incredibly risky, and they can be incredibly rewarding as a result. And they're the kinds of things that many managers and organisations say they want, but actually, as we're going to see as this class goes on, when faced with disruptive innovations, many organisations actually find them very scary and disable, or put barriers in the way of those innovations. So we've got sustaining disruptive innovations. As you'll see, a lot of the literature on innovation talks about product development, and it's more focused on what organisations do. But Michael Hammer suggests we can think about innovation in terms of operations as well. So think about not just about what organisations produce, but also how they work. And Hammer says this is key for many organisations. It's about being innovative, not just developing interventions to solve problems, but being innovative in the ways that you lead, you organise, you structure, you develop cultures, you work, you motivate, and you manage. So this is operational innovation. So where do innovations come from? What we might call innovativeness, or the capacity to innovate within an organisation, has been found to be correlated to a number of different factors. As we saw in our class on culture, some national cultures are more willing to innovate or have traits which are more supportive of innovation. Those that are more creative, less respectful of authority, those that are more willing to tolerate uncertainty, those kind of national cultures tend to be more innovative. Not necessarily the most efficient at then managing innovations, but often the best at creating innovations. You then have individual traits and capacities. Again, in the same way that you've got national cultures or national traits, individuals can be found through psychometrics to have particular personality traits or characteristics which tend to make them more innovative. And again, you can look back on our class on personality to see some of those factors. And then finally, there are a host of organisational factors, typically around culture, but also around structure, which have been found to increase innovativeness. So let's talk about some of them. In terms of cultural values that support development and innovation, it's been found that, let's just do this, innovation. Organisations which have respectful cultures, trusting cultures, cultures where there's a relative equalisation of power, cultures where there is a low level of confrontation but an openness, and cultures where there is a high level of participation, they tend to be more willing to engage in development and more open to innovations. And if you just think through some of those factors, it's kind of obvious why. If the organisation is a trusting environment where people are willing to try new things because they're not scared of failure, where people have power or autonomy to try doing something different if they think it's a good idea, we can kind of see why those cultural values are going to support creativity and innovation. But there's a whole host of these factors, and these are taken from the Christensen and Buchanan chapter in the 9th edition on change. There's a whole host of different organisational factors, some of which are, like I say, cultural, some of which are around process, and a good idea of process is idea time. It's been found that many of the most innovative organisations are willing to give their employees free time to try new innovations, and a good example here would be the development of the post-it note. 3M, which developed the post-it note, reportedly gave its employees something like an afternoon off every week, or its research employees an afternoon off every week, where they could just do what they wanted. They could pursue any project or idea that they liked. And out of this unmanaged time, an engineer came up with the Post-it note, which completely revolutionised their business. We see this even in very bureaucratic, very authoritarian organisations such as the army. Many national armies, certainly the British Army, give their soldiers time off for personal development, where they can train in whatever skills that they need. And this has led soldiers to go and investigate new forms of combat, new technologies, which their senior officials in the army, the leaders, didn't think about. So you've got cultural values in organisations which facilitate and allow people to be more creative, but also processes in organisations, things like creating free time for people to develop themselves. Another example here, it's not quite within an organisation, but I think it makes the point, is Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple, widely regarded as one of the most successful innovators of the last certainly several decades. Before his death, Steve Jobs gave a commencement address at an American college where he explained his approach to his life. And one of the things that he talked about was engaging in skill development, which at the time didn't seem particularly productive, but actually paid off in the long run. So he talked about how he took a calligraphy class in college and learned about the art and the aesthetics of very beautiful design in this calligraphy class, and learned skills which later on, when he was marketing and developing Apple products like the iPhone and the iPod, he used. And Jobs' point here was that to be innovative, you can't be calculating. You can't necessarily say, I'm going to do this because it's going to create this. Sometimes you have to be willing to experiment, willing to fail, willing to do something, not knowing where it's going to lead. And of course, this can be a real problem for many organisations. It's also been found that organisations, not only in terms of their cultures, but also in terms of some of the, what Edgar Schein would call the surface manifestations of their culture, help to shape whether or not they are innovative. Research has found, for example, that the spaces occupied by organisations facilitate or create barriers to innovativeness. So when you have spaces which enable collaboration, which are modifiable, so allow people to reconfigure them how they need, are attractive, and that symbolise the need to be innovative, often through like quite funky, cool, engaging, colourful surroundings. What this does is it symbolises the cultural value of being innovative, and it really supports innovation. It's also been suggested that space allows people in organisations to do the same thing that Steve Jobs was talking about. If you have spaces where people can have unplanned interactions, so somebody can be sitting on a couch and somebody randomly can come up and speak to them, well then you might find an organisation developing ideas, making connections, pursuing things which nobody had really planned out or thought of ahead. And this, I guess, really is the challenge for innovation in organisations. Organisation, by definition, is about planning something out, structuring work, deciding on what you want to do before you do it. And innovation is typically around not knowing what you're going to do. And this is the key tension, really, that a lot of the organisational factors that allow or encourage innovation tend to cede control away from leaders and top management and give it to people lower down. Another organisational factor is openness, being open not only to unplanned interactions within the organisation, but also unplanned interactions around the organisation. And a good example of this would be the development of the barcode, a technology which fundamentally revolutionised the whole world pretty much, created the infrastructure or the underlying technologies for pretty much everything that we have around us now. International global trade, the ability to make products in completely different countries and ship them around the world, sell them quickly, scan them, online shopping, Amazon warehouses, they all rely on barcode technology. But the idea for the barcode actually came about at a conference at a business school in America. And there was a businessman talking about how great it would be if he had a way of automatically identifying products. And this was overheard by a student who went away, thought it through, and developed and patented the technology. This is an example of innovation coming about by organisations being open to others, listening to and responding to them. So when we talk about innovativeness, there's not just organisational culture, there's also organisational processes, organisational structures at work which support innovation. Okay, so we've talked about some of the enablers of innovation. Well, let's talk about some of the barriers to innovation. Well, obviously we've already talked about some of them in terms of structured hierarchies, in terms of formalised working. Essentially, many of the factors of, or the features of mechanistic or bureaucratic organisations are seen to be barriers to innovation. Rosabeth Moss-Kanter, a very influential management guru, says that there's almost like a set of rules for stifling innovation, that if you wanted to have an organisation which doesn't pursue innovations, doesn't look to innovate, you would do these kinds of things. For example, regard any new idea from below with suspicion because it's new and because it's from below. So in other words, if it doesn't come from top senior management, you think, well, it can't be a good idea because people don't know what they're doing. You could express criticism freely but withhold praise. And of course, what does this do? It creates a culture of fear where people are not going to be willing to experiment, to offer potentially controversial views or ideas for fear of being criticised and never getting praised. And you can read through those in your own time. But hopefully you can see how a lot of those features of organisations which stifle innovation are kind of the opposite of those that enable them. But there's also some other explanations for innovation. It's very easy for us to focus on the Steve Jobs of the world and think that innovation is down to individuals or down to leaders and designers of organisations. A lot of this literature, like Moss-Kanter's work, suggests that all a leader needs to do is build a nice funky building, give people some free time, and they're going to create innovations. Well, that's not really true. There are some wider contexts going on outside of most organisations that we need to take account of if we want to understand innovation. Malcolm Gladwell says it's not enough to ask what successful people are like. We have to also ask where they're from. What does he mean by that? Well, what he means is typically there's lots of people doing the same innovations, but only a few of them ever actually work out. Only a few of these innovators become successful. So why is that? Sociologists have looked into this question, and they suggest that typically when innovations are successful, it's because of a almost lucky coincidence between a number of factors beyond individuals or organisations. So typically there'll be factors at work in the legal system, in technologies, in industry structures, within organisations, within the kind of career structures that promote people to be innovative, and in marketplaces. And each of these factors exists beyond individuals and outside of individual organisations. But if you want to look at any successful innovation, whether that's the iPhone or rock and roll music, whatever you might want to look at, there's usually an explanation in that wider context that's hard to see and hard to appreciate. But those that can appreciate it and act on it are often the ones that are most successful. Okay, so we've talked about organisational development and innovation. We've talked about some of the enablers and the barriers to innovation. Let's think a little bit more critically now about innovation. So, when we talk about innovation, sometimes we talk about what's called the diffusion. Let's just put that properly. The diffusion of innovation. That is, how is it that an innovation moves from one organisation to another? And it's been shown, and sometimes people put this on like a life cycle or a graph, which I think is a bit silly, but anyway, it's been shown though that most innovations work through a set of communities. So first you have the innovators that come up with the idea. Then you'll have a small number of early adopters that take up that innovation. Then you start to have a bigger group that's called the early majority, who start to change their behaviours or their ways of working following the innovation. Then you have the late majority, the followers. And then finally you have those people or those organisations who are the last to adopt the new ideas. Often these are the ones that have been very resistant to new ideas, very resistant to change, and eventually get forced to change against their will. And the word for this is laggards. And the key point here is that genuine innovations often cause changes, not because of innovators, but just because as they start to get adopted, it becomes harder and harder for the late majority and the laggards not to change their behaviour. And there's been research into this that shows once an innovation reaches a sort of critical mass or a critical point, everybody has to follow the trend. And the word for this is imitation. You get imitators, the number twos. In branding, sometimes we call these Me Too brands, the ones that are they haven't come up with the new idea, but they've started to use the new idea. They've made their own version of the product. But that's a nice story of how innovations work. But when we look at organisational innovations, whether it's processes or new products, we see some really interesting stories. There's some real dark sides of innovation. So let's first think about the dark sides of operational innovations. Many operational innovations allow organisations to do things more effectively. What that often means is more efficiently. In other words, many organisations involve the application of new technologies and making people redundant. We've talked about technological redundancy already on the course, or what's sometimes called downsizing, getting rid of people. This is what many organisations look for when they innovate. Typically, many leaders of organisations think of innovation as being about the application of technology. And this causes great stress in organisations. We'll talk a little bit about it in our video on organisational change, but even for the people that are being left behind thanks to innovations, it can be a very painful experience to go through organisational development and innovation. There's what's known as the survivor syndrome, where people who have survived an innovation have seen others be made redundant, for example, or leave, being forced out of new processes, not finding a home for themselves in new organisational cultures. And this is a very painful experience for those that survive, for a variety of reasons, not only because they've had to go through this change themselves, they might have to lose their friends and colleagues and co-workers, but also because it's become very clear to them that they might also then be the victims of the next innovation. We also see what's known as first mover disadvantage. In lots of the literature and lots of thinking on innovation, people assume that coming up with an idea first is the best thing to do. But actually, in many cases, it's a case of the second mouse getting the cheese, right? So if you think about a mouse trap, the first mouse is the one that gets splattered. The second mouse can go and get the cheese. There's so many examples of this. This is the first digital camera, which is developed within Kodak, which is a very big film company. They made film for cameras. And because they made film for cameras, although they came up with this digital camera, they didn't want to push it because their core business was making film. And they couldn't see how this disruptive innovation was going to work. So although they came up with it, they didn't take advantage of it. And actually, if you look at their share price and the performance of their organisation, they've pretty much almost died as an organisation, despite coming up with the very technology which later on has caused them to fail as an organisation. Think about MySpace versus Facebook, right? When I was younger, MySpace was the social network. In fact, MySpace was the social network which got people on social media, got people using social networks. But for a variety of reasons, people found it less and less appealing, less and less attractive. And although it was one of the first, one of the innovators, MySpace, was sold in 2011 for almost nothing. You look at that, it was bought for $580 million and was sold for $35 million. And now, isn't worth a great deal of money at all. Because although they were the early innovator, they were the early adopter, or the innovator of the technology, they became the losers because Facebook could come along offering a better product without any of the legacy issues of MySpace. And we see other examples within the literature on organisational development and innovation where the innovators have lost. A classic example of this would be Xerox. Xerox, technology company, probably some of you think about them in terms of printers, maybe computer software. Well, they actually developed and invented many of the features of the personal computer that we all use every day, things like the mouse. But the researchers that developed those technologies found that Xerox, this big hierarchical, mechanistic organisation, didn't really appreciate those radical innovations. And they just gave those technologies away to people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, who then designed around them. And one of the arguments here is that big companies often have a status quo bias because they've invested so much, big companies, big organizations, because they're set up around a particular product or service working. If there's a new innovation that risks that product or service, they're going to find it very, very difficult to reorganize. So they'll really cling on to what was the success to start off with. So, what does that mean? Well, it means there's a whole host of downsides to development and innovation. Although it's often seen as the future, the way that you make money by coming up with new ideas, if we look at the literature, actually coming up with new ideas can also be a great way to sow the seeds of your own organisation's failures. So, hopefully then, guys, we've now got into a situation where you can define organisational development, think about how that differs from organisational innovation, think about some of the enablers and barriers to innovation, and then consider the downsides to development. And I'm going to put an innovation in there because I think we've talked about both in this class. Hopefully, why did that do that? Let's just fix this, sorry. Hopefully you feel like you've met those objectives. If you've got any questions, please post them on Moodle or come to one of the drop-in question and answer sessions.